For many, the scaling of Mount Everest has stood as the ultimate challenge of one's strength and endurance. To reach its summit, a symbol of courage, an achievement of a lifetime. But for Doom players, there is NUTS.WAD. Legend has it that NUTS.WAD descended upon unsuspecting Doom players more than 2 decades ago. A map from the future in which players are dropped into a single map with more than 10,000 enemies of hell. For years, this map sat unplayable, pushing so many enemies that it brought even the most powerful PCs to its knees. And now, for the first time ever, NUTS.WAD is playable on a game console. There are those that said this day would never come. What are they to say now? But this feature is just the tip of the iceberg for this latest re-release of Doom and Doom 2. Helmed by Nightdive in cooperation with id Software and Machine Games, this new version of Doom is worth paying attention to, as it is the most feature-rich, best-performing version of Doom ever released on a game console. The latest version of Doom is available on PlayStation 5, Xbox Series consoles, the Switch, and of course, the PC. It's also available on last generation consoles, but for this video we'll be focusing on current generation platforms only. The game was transitioned over to Nightdive's Kex engine and brings with it plenty of enhancements, 120 frames per second support on consoles, 16-player multiplayer including co-op, a brand new soundtrack from the legendary Andrew Hulshult, and compatibility with Boom Source, making it possible to run actual mods. That's right, while the previous release supported approved WADs, this new version of the game has opened the floodgates, which brings us back to NUTS.WAD. You see, this is the first thing I wanted to test. It pushes beyond the limits of what the Doom engine was intended to handle, and now we can actually see those results running on a game console. The path to NUTS.WAD highlights this clunky but still usable mod browser. Essentially, you can browse through all the various mods and WADs that users have uploaded and then simply subscribe to them, which downloads them in the process. From there, it's as simple as loading it up and playing. It is a truly amazing feature. But before we jump into NUTS.WAD, I want to set the stage here because on PS5 and the 2 Xbox systems, if you're playing this game at 120 frames per second, you're going to get 120 frames per second. Well, okay, it's 119.18 frames per second, hence the 119 readout. This is a very optimized and fast version of Doom that handles basically everything I threw at it. It runs like greased lightning, and I wanted to raise this caveat because the challenge of NUTS.WAD is so extreme and cruel that I don't want people to get the wrong idea that this version of Doom runs slowly. The fact that it runs NUTS.WAD at all is cause for celebration. The other caveat here is that the Switch version is limited only to selected mods. You cannot freely run whatever you please, so keep that in mind. While at first I thought this might be due to performance, it's more likely that Nintendo simply doesn't allow it, since anything goes. So I started here on PlayStation 5 using the 120 FPS mode, and it was clear that suddenly the frame rate dropped significantly, as expected. It's only once you engage the enemies though that you know true horror. As a MIDI rendition of Led Zeppelin's Kashmir plays in the background, the frame rate continues to struggle. But again, this is expected given that this test stresses the engine in ways it really wasn't designed for. This is all just for fun, right? Well, with this in mind, I booted up Doom on the Xbox Series X and Series S. It was time for a showdown. The results? As I dove into the crowd below, the Xboxers cried out in unison, for the gods above did not smile upon them. I must admit, I was confused. This just doesn't make sense. I then pushed further, downloading a different variant of NUTS.WAD, one even heavier, and it's here that all 3 consoles began to scream out in pain, scraping the bottom of the frame rate barrel, barely able to touch 10 frames per second. The ghost of Perfect Dark laughs in the distance. Like the man who turns back from the highest peaks, the consoles have seemingly met their match today, and NUTS.WAD remains the champion. In addition, while I said we would focus on current generation consoles, Rich and I were curious to see what would happen if you launched NUTS.WAD on an Xbox One VCR, the original model. The result, well, perhaps predictably, it runs even slower. I think this is the lowest frame rate we've ever measured on the Xbox One. But okay, enough silliness. What the heck's going on here? Why is it so variable between these different platforms? Well, I actually asked some of the engineers that worked on this, and from what I could gather, it seems that it's either an issue with threads sleeping when they shouldn't, or an issue with code generation. It's fun to benchmark this map, of course, but it doesn't really say much about the respective system performance. Although this kinda gets to the nature of what this port actually is. You see, this is not a 3D accelerated game. Everything basically runs on the CPU. This new version is designed to replicate that original visual experience, and thus it is entirely software rendered, which I think is pretty nifty, honestly. But while Carmack's original BSP renderer persists below the surface, the development team made some serious improvements. The lead engineer wrote an entirely new texture mapper that basically fundamentally alters the way the game draws its graphics. It's better suited to modern hardware and faster as a result. The new version is also multi-threaded, but the way this manifests is really cool. Essentially, the screen is split up into multiple chunks, each with its own thread, drawing its own window. Due to variable complexity of any one map though, a load balancer was implemented which dynamically adjusts the width of each chunk according to the demands. It's a really slick way to divide up work between multiple threads, I think. So what's the benefit of going software rendered? Well, as an official release, this is a way to offer a perfect blend of enhancements such as perceived higher frame rate, higher resolutions and the like, while staying true to the core visual design of Doom. There's plenty of cool source ports out there, including the new Doom 2 Ray Traced, which is very cool, but the purpose of this port is to be completely faithful to the original, and I think they achieved that. That's not to say there aren't some key improvements though. For instance, in certain maps, the animated sky that was first seen in the PlayStation version of Doom has been implemented here, and it looks pretty rad. Also, as mentioned, it's possible to boost the rendering resolution all the way up to native 4K on current gen platforms and even the Xbox One X. Switch and others are limited to lower resolutions such as 1080p, but all versions have variable pixel scaling options, allowing you to go all the way down to the original Doom resolution if you desire. Still, I really like the way this version of Doom looks overall. But what about the PC version then? Well, that's where our resident PC expert Alex comes into play.
Thanks for the handoff there, John. So, what is there to say about Doom on PC? Well, it released 30 years ago. Okay, bye-bye now, thank you. Seriously though, there are a few specific things to the PC version of this re-release from Nightdive that need mentioning. The first thing that I want to mention are the options, or better said, the lack thereof. You do get some basic resolution options and VSync, but there's not too much here. I do like that you can change the internal resolution of the game, so you get the original resolution 2x, 3x, 4x, and max resolution, which is 4K for me here, but there aren't too many graphical options in this game. As an example of that, I really do like that you can play at the original pixel density of Doom. I'm a fan of playing older games at their original resolution, but in Doom's case here, I feel like the art on modern displays, even at that original res, is a bit prone to fizzling and aliasing. Notice how when I turn the camera here, how there's a lot of flicker and fizzle. I wish the devs at Nightdive looked into a separate control option for super sampling. Other source ports like GZ Doom support it, for example, and that keeps the art at its original resolution and without filtering, but it cleans up noise and flicker, like we can see in this shot here. Basically, I would just like to see some more control over how Doom looks, plays, and sounds. Other ports have lots of interesting options to delve into with hundreds of configurations for such things, while here there's not much to play with and make your own. For me, Doom is a prime example of the make it your own PC ethos. So this port being so lacking in that regard is a shame actually. But if it plays fine, then it should be good, right? Well, after having played a nice portion of Doom 2, I will say that it runs fine. No problems there. Though I did notice two oddities that affected my play. The first was the mouse. Mouse movement felt slightly loose in a way. It kind of turns too fast almost, in some way that I'm just not used to. The second thing I noticed was the movement of things did seem a bit off with regards to frame rate interpolation. John will have more on that in his video, but I think I also see what he sees there in this PC version. Beyond that, there is not too much to say about Doom's re-release on PC here. It is the game you've played before, and it is infinitely great for that. Though if you've played Doom on PC before, I'm not sure if this release here will sway you away from your favorite Doom source port. Still, it is easy to use and load up, and that definitely counts for a lot. So, back to you, John.
As Alex mentioned though, camera rotation is a strange issue right now. It's not clear why, but rotation, especially even rotation using an analog stick, doesn't appear as smooth as it should. If I slow down the video, maybe you can more easily see what I mean. There's these tiny stutters in the movement that are not present in previous versions of Doom released on modern consoles. It's not super noticeable during normal gameplay, but once you see it, it can be difficult to unsee it. Still, overall, things are pretty good. While the menu is somewhat simple for a PC game, it's rather robust for a console title. Things like FOV can of course be adjusted, along with many other customizable options. Certainly a huge leap over the last release of Doom. And all of this is wrapped in a beautiful and fast menu shell, which brings all Doom-related content together into a single application. Which brings me back to another key feature, and arguably one of the best things about this port, the music playback. So firstly, there's two main options here, a remixed soundtrack and the original. But really, that's just the surface, there's more to it than that. The remix soundtrack was composed by Andrew Hulshult, as I mentioned earlier, and for Doom 1 this brings the existing IDKFA tribute album Andrew made years ago into the game officially, which is very cool. But the big draw for me here is that he finally had a chance to do Doom 2's soundtrack. Sure, Andrew made a few tracks here and there, but finally the entirety of the soundtrack has been redone and it is sublime. Take a listen. However, there are fallback options as well. Many WADs feature their own music tracks, plus some folks may just want to use the original audio. For them, there's firstly the general MIDI option, which does a great job at recreating the sound of a Roland Sound Canvas SC55 sound module. This is the device on which Bobby Prince composed the soundtrack after all, and it sounds very faithful. other option though is FM synthesis, and this one surprised me. So firstly, there's an OPL2 style option, which produces a sound like that you'd expect from a Sound Blaster or AdLib card back in the day. But it's the DMX option that feels like a real game changer. This one is an FM patch set that leverages the OPL3 sound rather than 2, something very few games ever actually did at the time. This produces a much punchier, more interesting soundscape. Here's a comparison using the Sigil 2 soundtrack. Pretty cool, right? Speaking of which, music mods exist as well. For instance, I have Sigil 1 and 2 in their big box form and typically prefer playing with the digital soundtrack that's included with that version. Thankfully, this was also uploaded and can be installed on consoles via the mod menu. Speaking of the mod system again though, there is one flaw I need to point out. The uploading process, which allows users to put content into the game, currently does not exclude ZDoom content. Mods that require ZDoom functionality do not function with this version of the game. That means things like myhouse.wad are simply not playable, even if you see them in the browser. Remember, ZDoom is kind of its own thing at this point. It may as well be a completely different engine. Now, beyond everything else, there's also a brand new episode included called Legacy of Rust, and this was created by members of Nightdive, Machine Games, and id Software, and honestly, it's awesome. This crazy new episode is filled with new monsters that were brought back from old archives, there's new weapons in here, there's massive levels, and it's all just so perfect for showcasing the new 16-player co-op features. Which, by the way, has a modern co-op option, which allows things like respawning, which only occur when living players manage to get away from the monsters. You know, kinda like how Halo co-op has always worked. So yeah, it may seem like old hat re-releasing yet another version of Doom, but believe me, it's a version of Doom worth playing. If anything, it grants access to the most amount of Doom that we've ever had on consoles. And even better, if you owned the previous version of Doom on any of these platforms, this new version is absolutely free. Great stuff. But that's gonna do it for me. I hope you enjoyed this video, and keep on dooming.